Hello and good afternoon. My name is Valeria. I am representing Select today, and I'm happy that all of you showed up. Just as a quick reminder, Select is an NGO that aims to inform and connect everybody in the Select industry and basically anyone that is interested in cellular agriculture. This is the fourth session of the CASC seminar. So today we will be talking about the regulation of select products in the EU and in the whole world. As you can hear, today's session will be in English, as will be the next one. And a quick heads up, the next one is already next week. So we will still have a lecture, even though there is a national holiday. Today, we invited Professor Purnhagen from the University of Bayreuth. He's the co-director of the research unit of the German EU and the EU law. And yes, we also invited Valeria Teloni from the industry side, who works at the regulatory and compliance things in Mosa meets. I'm happy to turn over to Kai Purnhagen, so he will start with the scientific side, and after this, we will talk with Valeria about the more industry side. Feel free to use the Q&A session, and we will do the questions after both of the talks. Kai, if you're happy to share your screen.
More than happy to. So thanks so much, Seda, for inviting me and also for giving me the opportunity to speak in your line of reasoning. I'm sorry, I'll have to just concentrate on making it all nice and shiny for you. I hope now the screen can be assessed by everyone and that everything is good. So today I'm going to talk about the regulation of product for cellular agriculture in the EU and in the world. Once more, as I said, thank you so much for inviting me. My name is Kai Purnhagen. I'm the director of the Research Institute for Food Law at the University of Bayreuth, and also chairholder of the chair of food law. And we'll focus particularly on EU and international food law. And there we've also have a huge interest in researching the regulation of innovative food products. And that's probably one of the reasons why I'm here today to speak to you. Now, what we're going to start off with is that I don't think it actually comes as a surprise to most of you, and apologies for using a German newspaper article here in an international audience. But I think I've rarely found a more profound headline than this. This is from May 2023 from a major German economic journal. And it basically titles that Europe is really sleeping over the trends, the newest trends, the future of food. And why is that? Well, simply because, that's what the article argues, simply because of regulation. Because the regulation seems to be outdated, not up to date, and maybe even user unfriendly. I'm not too sure whether it's actually the regulation that is a problem, or the application of the regulation, but that I'll leave actually up to you to decide where we're gonna go. But if you look at the market if we compare the market now with 2024, so that was 1 year ago, and if you look at the market, how things have been developing, and if you look only at the plant-based products in the European Union, and those are, this is a graphic from the Good Food Institute, and data from the Good Food Institute, we can see that plant-based products in the EU have skyrocketed, particularly in Germany, with a turnover of 1.9 billion euros in 2022, and a plus of 11%. Now the UK, as everything in the UK at the moment after leaving the EU, has a bit of problems with the economy. Also, this is part of it, and therefore we see a minus 3%. But elsewhere, of those countries which still remained in the EU, it is basically a success story. Now, if we go a bit further and look into the respective products, the sales per products that have been also rising, particularly in area of meat, plus 7%, followed by milk, plus 13%, and other more processed food, with the exception of yogurt, have actually had a huge increase for plant-based or cellular agriculture products. Now, today we're going to look particularly, it doesn't come as a surprise that we're going to look particularly into milk and meat as an example, because those are the ones, the products that actually matter most. Now, let's look also at the challenges first before we go a bit deeper into the regulations and the challenges that we face there. Now, we all know that EU is very proud of having very high food safety standards. It's said that they're the highest in the world, and that has remained the case, and the EU is proud of that. And it might even be also one of the aspects that makes the European Union one of the most successful EU food markets in the world. So regulation actually is not only an obstacle, but it actually also works as a unique selling point for certain markets, if done wisely, one has to say. Because regulation has a certain insurance function, which means that once you've complied with the regulations, then you basically are more or less safe when something happens. And you don't have to take out insurance for these areas. And there's also studies that say, imagine you would have to take out insurance for the same things that actually tested in regulations, you would be much, much, much worse off. So regulations are usually, if applied correctly, a relatively cheap way of providing safety on the market and providing predictability, if done properly. Now, we see that particularly food innovations, the European market has a very high standard. But the problem is exactly that, what you just emphasized. It is not so much the regulations per se, but it's rather the unpredictability. You don't know exactly what to do. It's very uncertain because the current regulations are not really made fit for purpose for what, most of you and also we in our research, the challenges we face there. So there's a really, really difficult process to rely on. It has very much uncertainty because of costs for the business operators, and therefore it's also hard to communicate this to investors, what the costs actually are. There's also a lot of uncertainty regarding the regulation, particularly of market access. Am I a novel food? Am I not? How does it work? And on top of it, maybe also due to a lot of better marketing, there seems to be an easier, clearer market access in other countries, particularly to the US and Singapore. Now, if you look at the final products on the market, the US is a bit better, but not so much actually. And Singapore is also not that many products actually being approved, but at least they convey an image that it's much better and easier to get to there. If you look at the data, it's not cheaper. And by the end of the day, also if you compare it to the market access afterwards, it's not necessarily better. But at least that is what has been, what is on the market. And indeed, they have a better service for food innovators to get to the market. Now, if you look at more particularly the regulatory challenges that each one of us faces, it's usually two big blocks. One is the authorization for cell-based products so market access. And the second one is labeling. How can I label the respective products? Those are the big chunks of problems that we face in our regulatory examples. Some also use patents. Some also say patents, but that's from a legal side, at least it's not such a big problem as authorization and labeling. Therefore, I leave patents out of the equation here. And as there is this problem with a potential big brain drain, I'm also going to cover a very broad comparative analysis with Singapore and the US regulations. Now, the limitations of that talk in all the studies is what we've seen, and I have to also mention that this presentation is built not only on the law, but also a lot of interviews that we've been at the chair conducting with a lot of business partners. And so this is the accumulated knowledge that we've acquainted for the last couple of years. And to be quite honest, we were pretty shocked to the companies that we talked about regulation, that a huge number of them had no idea about the regulatory framework. They really, a significant number even were not, didn't have any clue that their products might be subject to approval procedures, or that they actually have to have some regulatory burdens after the respective product is ready for the market. Now, for those of you who actually had some, there were actually not that many that actually had looked into regulatory issues. There's also a lot of insecurities because EFSA is not very open. And it's not like you can call up at the FDA, you get a case handle and can basically rely on the information. EFSA is very closed shop and doesn't really help anyone. Now, what makes things worse also, particularly for the US market, is that there's usually no consumption history of food innovations. Because if there's consumption history, it's much easier to get market access. Now, that we don't have usually in the largest number of food innovations. And what we've also seen is, in our interviews at least, the willingness of business and particularly startups to collaborate with us is very limited. There seems to be a common understanding that a lot of information remains in the company, nothing is shared. So it's not like an open space of information, but it's rather a lot of different startups working in silos, not really willing to engage into dialogue, or even with scientists to share information. Now, those were the limitations of everything that we've had to face with, and regardless of that, we came up with some solutions of how these respective companies or food cell-based products can be regulated. Now, of course, it depends on the respective product and the respective details of the technique. But I've chosen a product to exemplify the regulations, which is precision fermentation and a cheese, particularly the casein made in cheese from precision fermentation, because this is a case which would say is exemplifiable and also can be extrapolated to other areas. Now, what we've seen over here very often in cell-based food innovations is that it's somehow, before the final product comes to market, there's somehow a genetically modified microorganism involved. Either some who trains an enzyme, or something which makes the substrate a bit more potent. So something always happens in the beginning with GMOs, very often at least. And the point is that also very often at the same time, the genetically modification will not remain in the final product, but somewhere on the way, there is some genetic modification involved. And that means we have to do with so-called GMMs, or genetically modified microorganizations. So in the case of precision fermentation, for example, we see a certain type of yeast, which is usually genetically engineered to produce the casein. But the casein is then later on used in the cheese. But that doesn't mean that there's no regulations, because in the European Union, we do have very strict regulation, everything that has to do with genetically modification. So those productions of the yeast, they are subject to GMM regulation. They need to be controlled, cultivated under controlled conditions, and the controlled conditions in special laboratories, which are specially identified and authorized to work with these GMMs. So if we look at how that actually works, is that there is indeed, from those products that we know, so-called what we call a qualified presumption of safety. And once it has a qualified presumption of safety, it is a bit easier to work with, because then the regulations or the respective regulations are not so strict anymore. But however, all GMM work is covered by the so-called Directive 2009/41 on the contained use of genetically modified microorganisms. And there we have all the regulations that are actually important to apply when we work with these GMMs. So as you can see, and that's what we've tried to put on this page over here on the left-hand side, is quite a cumbersome process to get to this situation. But it's worthwhile to work forwards to a so-called qualified presumption of safety. And the procedure to get there, this is what we've actually have identified here and on this slide. So there's a special, I won't go into details how that respective structure works, but if you're looking into a GMM and you would like to have it produced with a qualified presumption of safety, it might save you the hazard and trouble of going to the rest of the GMM directive. Now, if that is the case, you first have to identify what actually a GMM is. And a GMM is a microorganism in which a genetic material has been altered in such a way that does not occur naturally by mating or natural recombination. Now, what is important for you to know is that there is an exemption in the directive on so-called mutagenesis, use of mutagenesis. It's the same thing, the same exemption as we have in the other regulation. Directive on genetically modified organisms. And therefore, the Court of Justice's argument that had made mutagenesis part of genetically modified organisms can be transferred also to genetically modified microorganisms. So if you use CRISPR, for example, and if you use mutagenesis techniques, they can qualify as well as GMMs. So whenever you work with these kind of microorganisms, you have to go through the procedure of the Directive 2009/41. So that basically means that you will have to notify under certain circumstances your respective laboratory if you work with specific substances. So we have 4 different classes. We have classes 1 and 2, and those just need notification. But if you have higher classes, which are deemed to be more problematic from a regulatory point of view, that is most of the times genesis, then you would need an authorization for these kind of laboratories so you can work with the respective genetically modified microorganisms. And indeed, there's EFSA guidance on that. The problem is once more that there is no guidance beyond that. So you would probably need regulatory advice if you really would like to use these kind of techniques. The famous garage of the Swedish researcher experimenting with CRISPR is therefore not possible usually in the European Union for this very reasons. Now, if you need to go through an authorization procedure, which very often is the case, you would have to ask yourself 2 questions. First and foremost, is your product, and now we go back to the product, actually a GMO or is it a novel food? It's very, very unlikely that a food innovation would not go through either of those approval procedures. There are other procedures of approval we will cover here, which contain, for example, ingredients and so forth and so forth. But these 2 ones are the major ones that are of interest. So the first question that you always have to ask yourself when you want to market a product is it a GMO and needs to go through that approval procedure? Or is it potentially novel food that needs to go through that approval procedure? And that is very important to know because the GMO procedure is much more costly and much less success rates than, for example, novel food procedure. Now, what is also for most people in the innovation sector new is that the placing on the market of a GMO is not only the placing for sales, It also is tasting and transportation. So if you get your product to a fair, for example, and you want to transfer it to the fair, you already have to apply for a novel food approval procedure, for example. If you would take your product for tasting sessions, and I know the Netherlands doesn't do it differently, but that doesn't mean that it's illegal. That includes tasting events. We can go into detail why it is covered by the novel food regulation and why the Netherlands do it differently and why the Dutch approach is illegal. And we can really go into this, but that is unfortunately the case. So unless the novel food regulation doesn't change, placing on the market includes tasting and transportation. Now, imagine you would like to know whether your final food product contains GMOs or whether you have to go through GMO procedures. Now, the rule of thumb is if there's no GMO in the final product anymore detectable, then you don't have to go through the approval procedure. If there is GM in the final product, you have to go through the approval procedure. That is the rule of thumb. Now, what is interesting for particularly most of food innovations is that very often happens is that you train a certain substrate or bacteria or enzyme to produce something else. Now, in the directive on GMOs has clear distinction between food produced from a GMO and produced with a GMO. If a food is produced from a GMO, then it is covered. It is covered by the GMO regulation. If it's produced with a GMO, then it's not. Now, what is the difference? The difference was included for the following case. If you feed a cow with GMO feed, and then sell the food later on as the meat later on as non-GMO, that is fine because the cow's meat was produced with GMO, but not from a GMO, because from the feed doesn't necessarily result meat. But with the help of feed, you create meat. And that was the idea behind it. Now, extrapolating this to food innovations, very often you have this similar situation. You have a bacterium or you have something else where you produce the final, with which you produce the final product. And if that is the case, then the GMO regulation is not applicable. And that is very handy because then you don't have to go through the GMO approval procedure. So, distinction between from a GMO and with a GMO. Now, if we go a bit further, then the question is, what happens, however, with those products where you use the GMO to produce the final product, but which cannot be found the final product? Those are so-called processing aids. So those are substances which is not consumed as a food by itself, but they have a technological purpose during treatment processing. They may result in unintentional but taking unavoidable presence in the final product. If they do not present any health risk and do not have no technology effect on the final product, then the respective process, then there is no labeling required for this respective product. So if you have a processing aid, which is a product that helps producing the respective product, the respective food product, and that itself is done with GMOs, then you also don't have to label the final product as GMOs. So first distinction, with GMOs or from a GMO. Next distinction, processing aid or not processing aid. All right, now, how if we go now to pre-market approval? Do you have to approve novel foods or a genetically modified food? There we have in the European Union a so-called zero tolerance approach. If there is GMO in the final product, you have to authorize, no matter what. Labeling is a different issue, as we've seen, but the authorization procedure is to be needed when there is a GMO in the final product. Now, in practice, we have the following problems. There's no standards with which the DNA needs to be detected. And depending on the standards you apply, how sensitive the standard is, you find one or you don't find a GMO. Second, the standards and the methods are getting more refined. So it could be that you did have an authorized, you have a product on the market, and while it was on the market, there was no traces of GMO in the final product. Now the methods of detection get better, and all of a sudden you find traces of GMO from a product on the market, and then you would have to go through the approval procedure again. So, and that is a bit of a challenge at the moment because of the zero tolerance approach in the European Union. If there's no rDNA in the final product, then one goes to a so-called novel food procedure. And novel foods are all those foods which are on the market of the European Union, which have not been on the market of the consumer European Union and not consumed to a significant degree in the EU before the 15th of May 1997. Why 15th of May 1997? It's not that food became particularly dangerous after that date, but it is because that is where the regulation came into effect. And the idea was one could not require from any food producers before, without knowing this regulation, that this needs to undergo an approval procedure. So this is the cutoff deadline. If you can somehow show that your food product has been consumed to a significant degree in the union before that date, there is no novel food approval procedure. But interestingly, it's not only the final product, but it is also the process that is being used. So if you produce a final product, if you have the final product that has been consumed in the market, but you use a new process to produce that product, then it's also a novel food and needs authorization. And that is very often the case with food innovations. We have something that was on the market before, but you use a different means to produce it. And also in the regulation, it says explicitly food consisting of, isolated from, or produced from microorganisms, fungi, or algae. So there's a positive list, and therefore these are novel foods. As you can see, it's very difficult to escape the novel food regulation, and it's very difficult to escape authorization of novel foods. And I know there's all kind of cookbooks out there, and all kind of people that tell you how to escape the novel food regulation. And I would strongly recommend you not to fall for these, because most of the times they're wrong. It's worth a try, but if you not succeed, then you'll have to pay. So my advice is always count in the novel food procedure before you market, and for the investors, count in the process, because count in the cost, and then simply go through it. Okay, so how does the approval procedure works? Well, we'll just skip that a bit, because it's pretty simple actually. I'll just go through it quickly. Maybe you apply with EFSA, so not with national authorities, unlike in GMOs. Excuse me, for the GMOs regulation, you apply with the national authorities, and those will submit the dossiers to EFSA. EFSA can then issue a scientific opinion, and then in the European Commission will decide upon it after holding a so-called comitology procedure or committee procedure, where member states can decide on political grounds whether to grant the authorization or not. And this is usually the bottleneck, because you never know what's going to get out of this committee procedure. And the committee procedure has a very interesting outcome, because if there's a draw on the committee procedure, with GMO approval procedures usually is, then the commission decides, and the commission usually decides in favor of GMO authorization, because there's usually a positive scientific assessment from EFSA. And the commission does not want to replace scientific opinions with political ones, unlike the member states. Now, if you look at the novel food regulation, you would have to go through this. then you can, and that is actually quite interesting, consult with a national competent authority before to confirm the classification of the application. So is my food actually novel food? This is what your national competent authority can tell you. So it's like an MI regulated procedure in the FDA in the US. Interestingly, however, this assessment of the national competent authority does not bind EFSA afterwards. But as they consult EFSA while making the assessment for you, it's very likely that EFSA won't deviate from it. As a little side note, Germany is at the moment thinking of expanding that procedure to a more kind of consultancy procedure for food innovators that will actually help you through the authorization procedure. And I hope that this is going to happen very soon. What is also interesting from your perspective, if you're successful with the novel food authorization, this is a generic authorization, so it can be used by anyone. However, if your data has been used in the application procedure, you have the possibility to get appropriate data protection for 5 years, and that in fact gives you an exclusive marketing of the product for 5 years, although it's a generic authorization. Generic authorization. I have also here in the on the slide, I've shown you some experiences and examples of what is actually at the moment to be decided by EFSA. Now, labeling is another issue, which I told you is one of the major aspects after authorization. Now, the question is always, how can which kind of name can one use to label a product? You've seen, and you probably you've seen or you've witnessed yourself on the shelves of the supermarkets, the no milk or not with cow, and avoiding soy milk because soy milk is not allowed in the European Union shelves. Why is that the case? Well, it's a bit complicated, the whole issue around that. And I'm also expecting some changes here, but changes are always very slow. So let's go one after another and see why this is the case, what is actually possible. So Article 9 of the so-called Food Information Regulation stipulates that the name of the food shall be its legal name. Now, the problem is that a lot of names for products are in the Common Market Organization. The Common Market Organization is a organization or a regulation which protects producers, traditional producers. And therefore, the legal name is very often chosen according to the protection of the existing agricultural market. And that we see with a lot of products. So for example, milk is protected by common market organizations as meaning exclusively the normal memory secretion obtained from 1 or 2 milkings without either addition thereto or extraction therefrom. And interestingly, in most of the sustainable innovative products, we would like to avoid milking procedures, and therefore that has a consequence that, however, the milk name is not possible because of this protective regulations in the Common Market Organization. And that is currently the case. That's why we see all these "this is no milk" products in the European Union on the shelves. Now, so here we've seen it once more. So milk products, that same accounts not for milk, but to milk products, whey, cream, butter, cheese, yogurt. You cannot actually name them in such a way if they are not derived exclusively from milk in such a way that we have seen before. And then we've seen with a lot of product categories. That is why, yeah, one has to be very innovative also with naming these products. Now, the origin of this so-called Tofu Town judgment of the European Court of Justice, where it basically said, no, where there is no exemption, milk is milk, and that's what we see in the Common Market Organization, and we cannot for no reason deviate from that. That has been decided in 1997, so it's a bit old. Meanwhile, we had a lot of other judgments, particularly in Germany and in the Czech Republic, which had a bit of a smarter solution. And they basically said, look, okay, we like tofu town. That's okay. We agree with that. But if the interest of the consumer is really the protective scope, and the consumer has really no reason to believe that this is not an alternative to the old product, then the labeling is also fine. So as a consequence, soy milk is not possible, but milk alternative with soy is possible, and according to these judgments. And so if it's clear to the consumer that it's an alternative to the other product, then according to national legislation and just endorsed by the highest Czech administrative court, it is possible. It has not been yet endorsed by the European Court of Justice, so there's still a possibility that the European Court of Justice, at some point, if it ever gets to decide, says no also to that alternative. But at the moment, it seems like that is becoming settled case law. So once more, soy milk, tofu butter is not possible. Milk alternative with soy, butter alternative with tofu is possible. Okay. Now, I'll skip this because this is one of these ideas of how labeling will actually play out. And there's some arguments also for back and forth and pro and contra regulation in this respect, whether it's good or whether it's not good to go into these areas. But we'll leave that aside. So one important issue concerned indeed the labeling of the name. Now, there's also other labels which are usually quite important for food innovators, and that concerns, for example, and most important, the vegan label. Now, first and foremost, there are no regulations in the European Union on what to name vegan or not. Some national legislation exists, but there's no harmonized legislation at the European Union level. So most businesses comply with the so-called V label, which is a private organization. And they actually allow a small contamination of animal ingredients, such as 0.1% in 1 kilo. And for that reason, there's a lot more that can be labeled vegan than we would expect. So, for example, plant-based alternatives, such as precision fermentation, which are actually, by the end of the day, 100% of animal ingredients, more or less. But the original animal ingredient was only a string of DNA, and the rest was produced in laboratory. It can be labeled vegan for that matter. Cell-based meat probably can also be named vegan for exactly that reason, which is interesting by itself. The organic label is also interesting for most food innovators because the premiums on the markets are higher once you are able to attach an organic label to it. Now, the problem is that most of the food innovations won't comply with organic regulation, not simply because organic is not actually, despite of it says so in the regulation, looking at the most sustainable option, but it looks into the most nature-based options. And very often, this is what we cannot see and what we cannot apply to food innovation. So organic certification is usually out of the picture. Health and nutrition claims can be made if there is scientific evidence and if they are approved at the European Union for that respective product. Designation of origin also needs to comply with the respective regulations in that, but there is no difference to established products and innovative products in this respect. Now, we'll leave the labeling part and look a bit into the comparative analysis, as I said, and we just look into Singapore and the US, where very often it's meant to be more highly, which seems to be more attractive for most food innovators. Now, in Singapore, there's also novel food authorization. And it's like in the US, like in the EU, the novel foods are those which do not have a history of safe use. Now, The difference is simply not the regulation, but its application. Namely, the approval time is much shorter and the application process is much easier because you do have a case handler in Singapore. But on the substance, what is tested in Singapore is not so much different to the European Union. It's simply more efficient, which may already be a plus. Now in the US, there's a slightly different procedure. Mostly in the US, food innovations are concerned with the so-called generally recognized as safe procedure. And there is a self-affirmation in the US which governs the GRAS procedure and which will be notified with EFSA. For this, we've seen it is not less costly than a normal food procedure in the US. That is not, in the EU, that is not the case, but it's definitely shorter approval time if you go through the GRAS procedure. And it is much easier because you can call up someone at FDA who will help you with the procedure. And that is a big difference to what we have in the EU. Now, I'll stop here also to save some time. I'll stop here, and I hope I was able in a very short amount of time to bring you some insights of a very, very complicated topic. And I hope I didn't bore you to death with some legal remarks that I was bringing forward here. And please do not hesitate to ask questions in the respective questions panel. And without further ado, I would give the floor to Valeria, and she will enlighten us a bit more on the meaty side of the aspects. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kai, for the introduction, and thank you to Cellular Agriculture Germany for inviting me to this very interesting series. I've learned a few things myself. I'll jump right into it. The topic of my presentation today is the preparing a novel food dossier for a cultivated meat from a producer perspective. And I'm Valeria Teloni, a regulatory and compliance expert at Mosa Meat. Quick introduction of Mosa Meat. It's a company that was founded in 2016. We are located in the south of the Netherlands, in Maastricht, and we are around 130 people pioneering a cleaner, kinder way of making beef. I will kind of touch upon Mosa Meat as a company throughout this presentation, so this is enough for now. Kai kind of touched upon this topic already. There is no international, global, if you will, definition of what a novel food is, but in general terms is a type of food that does not have a significant history of consumption or is produced by a method that was not used before. Despite novel food being really important in providing sustainable food, better animal welfare, and all the positive the advantages that were already described during this series, the industry remains a very high regulated industry. If you look throughout the, let's say, global approval, so what you see here is by all means not a comprehensive list. It's also a list that tend to changes quite frequently because every other month you have a sort of update. Real quickly, we can start from the first country that ever approved cultivated meat product, Singapore, in 2020. It is also the country where we have the latest approval in 2024. There are several dossiers currently under submission by the Singapore Food Agency, and it also is a country where you have a framework for tastings, as what you see here. We jump to the US. You have, at least for meat, not for seafood, not for fish. For meat, you have a joint responsibility between the FDA and the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, who are in charge of assessing the safety of cultivated meat. There are 2 products approved there, and several dossiers ongoing. Australia recently approved a product as well, the same in Israel. In Israel, you also have the possibility to do tastings. Kai mentioned about tastings. Thank you for the introduction. What you see here in the Netherlands, we have a code of practice that regulates the tasting of cultivated meat. And that's the first, let's say, a milestone of the first tasting in the EU. There has been a tasting in Iceland. You might have seen it in the news. Back to regulation, the UK, since Brexit, they have their own kind of application system. They have maintained some of the rules of the EU, but they are proposing a few reforms to kind of streamline the process. And we know there has been a submission there. The same goes for Switzerland. Switzerland will accept unauthorized novel food from the EU, but not the other way around. South Korea has started to publish a regulation for cultivated meat. And what I have highlighted here in dark gray is like countries like Canada, China, Japan, also in the Middle East. If you go to these countries, to the Ministry of Health website or other ministries, depending on the country, you will find some sort of novel food regulation, although I haven't listed here all potential submissions and approvals. What I want to talk today about is mainly the European process, because cultivated meat, after all, is an European innovation. It started with a project funded in the Netherlands by Dr. Van Elen that brought together academics and business leaders, and that's when all started. And in 2013, Mark Post and Peter Verstraete, who are also the co-founder of Mosa Meat, introduced the first cultivated burger. So we just passed the 10-year anniversary of that event. So cultivated meat is a European innovation. At Mosa Meat, we don't escape the novel food regulation, but we rather embrace it. Before we can talk about the novel food regulation, I'm making one step back. So in Europe, you have something that is called the General Food Law, which defines safe food as a food that has been produced, stored, and processed in a way that does not contain chemicals or microorganisms in concentrations that can be harmful to humans upon consumption. This general food law, in addition to that, the EU has also established a set of regulation and recommendation that will help maintain this concept of safe food. Like Kai said, Europe has always adopted a very cautionary approach to food safety. So inside this general food law, you have a flotilla of many different regulations and directives. Again, by all means, this is not a comprehensive list. And one of them is the novel food regulation. So if you're not a food additive, if you're not a flavor, if you're not a supplement, and if you're not a GMO, like Kai explained, you are most likely a novel food. In our case, in the case of cultivated meat, for some products, for some biotechnological problem, I know it can be difficult to understand if you are a novel food or not. And there are actually tools that you can use to understand that, also provided by the EC. In our case, it is clear that we are novel food because we were not consumed to a significant degree before 1997, like it was just explained. And we fall under at least one of the 10 defined categories that you find inside this regulation. You can go and look up all the categories. We specifically cultivated meat fall within category number 6 because we are produced from cell culture derived from animals. So this is what we are. I'll not go into the GMO discussion because Kai already explained it very, very well. You can see here the number of novel food applications and updated until last year. And you will, none of these applications are actually made for a cultivated meat product. So from a product produced from cell culture derived from an animal. The closest thing that we have recently seen is the authorization for a novel food that is a cell culture biomass derived from apple. And this was adopted. So there was the EFSA opinion, as you can see here, in May 2023, and the European Commission adopted the opinion of EFSA a few months later. And I'll tell you a bit more in details how this EFSA European Commission interaction works. So this is the closest product that I've seen personally to a cell culture product, not from animals but from plant. Here you have the visual of the process. So when you want to submit your dossier, actually you submit it to the European Commission. One of the most common misunderstanding is that the submission is done to EFSA and EFSA will approve the product. That is not correct. So the application is done to the European Commission, who in principle may decide to approve the product as is. However, for cultivated meat, we do not expect that to be the case. We expect that the European Commission will give the mandate to EFSA to conduct a risk assessment to assess the safety of the product. Before you do that, you need a pre-submission ID. You go on something that is called EFSA Connect. You get your pre-submission ID. That's the moment where you can start to get general pre-submission advice. So EFSA does give advice. However, at this stage, they tend to be on the procedure rather than the content, and I will come back to this. You need to notify your studies. And also, I will give more details about this. And these studies concern some degree of analysis that you do on your product to demonstrate its safety. So you need to notify that you are starting such studies. Finally, you have your dossier submission, which is based on, again, several different documents that I haven't listed all of them here. But for me, the most important one, let's call it my Bible these days, is the EFSA guidance on the preparation and submission for the application of a novel food. Very recent use. So the latest revision is from 2021. Actually, there is a new revision that has been already published, and also there has been a public consultation, and is expected to be adopted in this year. So that's a very big update with a lot of changes to the guidance. EFSA also has a LinkedIn group as a support for applicants. So there are ways to contact EFSA. However, I agree with Kai that the system is not so easy and let's say easy to use like for other geographies. Once you have submitted your dossier, there is a validity check performed by the European Commission. This is typically should be almost instant. There should be no much delay but in principle, you can be required to provide missing information. Then, as I mentioned, the EC will give the mandate to EFSA to conduct the safety assessment. And that's when EFSA starts what is called the suitability check to ensure that everything that they need to perform the assess is in your dossier. Here it says that it should last 30 days. However, in recent years, this time has stretched quite considerably, up to several months in certain cases. And this is one of the reasons that EFSA has decided to update the guidance to give applicants like us better information, better details as to so to have a better dossier in the end. During this period, so during the suitability check and all the way to the risk assessment, you can have clarification teleconferences with EFSA, in addition to other tools. Again, I'm not describing every little detail, just to give you an idea. There is a decision on confidentiality. I'll tell you a little bit more about this. The legal time for the risk assessment is 9 months plus the stop clocks. So typically the process, the overall process, as you can see here, is between 18 months and 3 years, sometimes longer when companies have to generate new data, and so it might take even longer. Just to give you an idea, Singapore is, after the suitability check, is between 9 and 12 months. When EFSA, at this point, when EFSA has published their scientific opinion on the safety of the novel food for, very important, its intended use, it goes back to the European Commission and the member states that is responsible to propose the condition of use for the product. Something that Kai mentioned, for example, the labeling, the nomenclature, also any monitoring. So, for example, when the first insects products were approved, they also implemented monitoring systems to see how these foods in real life were behaving. That's what is happening at this stage. That's the risk management phase, which is back to the European Commission and the member states, who will vote on the adoption of the EFSA opinion. In this vote, you need 55% of member states covering 65% of the EU population. And when you get to that threshold, your product is authorized and it is added to the union list, the positive list of products that can be marketed in the EU. And as Kai mentioned, it is a generic approval, so you won't see Mosa meat in there. That's basically what it means also in practice. So we say that it was mentioned that EFSA is not so approachable as other geographies. In fact, last year we had quite a few interactions with EFSA through trade associations like Cell Agriculture Europe and other association that have been mentioned during this online series already. So you can look up these events online. There are quite some interesting presentations, both by EFSA, also the European Commission, and also the producers, which with very interesting and up-to-date information on this topic. What I can say that while we think that a very thorough risk assessment is very important to give consumers the confidence that our products are safe. At the same time, we were quite united in asking for more pre-submission advices. So this is also the message that we have brought on several occasions in front of the regulation. So we hope there will be some changes there. So what do you need in order to be approved? I put approval in brackets because that's not really the perfect term. You get authorized for the intended use that you have proposed. So that's an important distinction to keep in mind. But in summary, your novel food doesn't pose a safety risk, does not mislead the country, and particularly if you are replacing an existing food, you cannot be nutritionally disadvantaged. So these are the three main pillars that a company needs to think about when you start working on an application. I will mainly talking about the safety during this presentation. I mentioned early the notification of studies and the decision of confidentiality, and Kai also mentioned this in his presentation. So the regulation on transparency and sustainability of the EU risk assessment in the food chain, that's the full title of the regulation, is applicable since 2021. This is is after Brexit, so does not apply if you submit in the UK. And basically is about public disclosure of novel food dossiers and having a transparent process. You have the possibility to ask for confidentiality for a period of 5 years. You have seen in the previous slide, it says decision on confidentiality, and that's because EFSA can decide if a piece of information that you have marked as confidential is critical to the safety of the product, it might still be decided to disclose it. But if you get the confidentiality, it's for 5 years. This transparency regulation also brought new responsibilities on top of the existing one for the applicants. So for us, you need to notify your studies. And if you fail to do so, you may incur in a penalty of 6 months. So this is quite a burden for us, for the applicants, for the producer. I mentioned the union list of novel food. So that's the it's a implementing regulation that gets updated by the European Commission every time there is a new novel food approved. So the novel food is added there together with the condition of use, any labeling requirements, and the novel food specifications, which I have an example here. So I'm going back to the apple to the apple biomass. So the apple biomass made from cell culture of apples, Swiss apples. So here the specification looks very much like this, but every product has its own peculiarities. So not all specifications are the same, but they are the ones that are relevant for the product. This is very important also for us manufacturer, because once your product is approved, you need a robust product, because you need to be able to manufacture according to these specifications. And we have seen in previous presentation issues about like consistencies and robustness. This is also where specifications becomes relevant. Back to Mosa meat. It's very good that that I've had very interesting presentation before mine. So for details and more information on the technology itself, you can go back to the presentation that was given on April 29. But in a nutshell, what happens is that we select cells from donor animals. We isolate those cells. First, we proliferate those cells into a bioreactor. We have, and I'll come back to this, like growth media that will help the cell to proliferate. We also refresh nutrients until the cells, and some companies might stop at this stage. Otherwise, you can go further with differentiation and tissue maturation. So it's a different phase. You need a slightly different growth media that will tell the cells to do different things compared to proliferation. Then you harvest your product. In our case, we can harvest fat and muscle separately. And then it's when the product development starts, but also when an important part will start, which is the analysis of your novel food for things like micronutrients, micronutrients, impurities, potential contaminants, but also vitamins and minerals, and so on and so forth. If we focus a little bit more on the food safety aspects, there are, let's say, 4 main areas of focus. You can have various species, starting species and cell type. So different species might bring a different safety concern, whether it is a cow or a chicken, for example. We have heard Kai talking about genetic modification. So it could be cultivated meat might be manufactured through genetic modification. It is not the case for Mosa meat. The process itself, what type of scaffolding are used? Are they already like approved scaffolding, like approved food additives, or something new? Genetic stability, when you have population doublings throughout the process, is that causing any genetic instability? And this, for example, is one of the addition to the new guidance that there are a little bit more specific about this point. Then, of course, the growth media. Some materials were never used in food before. And this is another nice bridge to the presentation of Marius, Professor Henkel. He described how growth factors can be made by precise fermentation. And he already anticipated that cultivated meat will be that will be relevant for cultivated meat, and he was not wrong. So if you want to know how these growth factors are made, you can watch his presentation. But these growth factors, they are present. Some of them are present to some extent in mammals, in milk, but they were never used to make food before. And I have later an interesting question for Kai about this, whether these are considered processing aids or not. Also toxicity and allergenicity, because you are adding raw materials that might be of plant origins. For example, is that giving allergens or proteins that are giving allergens, and of course the toxicity of the raw materials. You have to look at the literature and existing toxicity studies for your raw material. And last but not least, the analytics. This is what you see here is a 20-day-old fat from cultivated fat from Mosa meat. So there are conventional food is analyzed, tested every day around the globe. However, our products might have a different metrics, different type of metrics for the analysis compared to conventional food. So you might need to develop specific method for your product. You have to be able to detect at least the critical components in your media components. And of course, again, as I mentioned, if you are replacing conventional food, what is your nutritional value? This is a picture inspired by the EFSA guidance on the preparation of a novel food dossier. It consists of different sections that you have to go through and prepare for your dossier. The first one is the identity. So what cells you're using, what species, what is the biological source, the taxonomy of your source. In our case is the Bos taurus, the cow, cattle or beef in culinary terms. So, but some companies might be working with more like peculiar species or things that needs a more like study of the taxonomy. But the identity is what is your novel food about, where does it come from, etc. The production process is quite an extensive chapter. Is you need to describe to quite detailed level the provided description of your production process, culture conditions, key parameters. A recent addition to the guidance, to the new guidance, is also, for example, food contact materials. And if you think of a cell culture process that can last several weeks and go through several, maybe different bioreactors, tubing, that can become quite intensive package of data on contact materials. As a plan, in regards the food safety and critical control points, which also needs to be provided. It's a very specific topics. It also includes hygiene measures, as I mentioned, quality control points, flow charts of your production process. Raw materials, anything that goes into the system, you need to disclose. You need to have specifications, any coating, any diluents, any buffers that you are using needs to be disclosed. You also have to discuss the safety of your cell bank. So when you take the cell from a donor animal, that they are sterile, that there is no mycoplasma contamination, no viral agents, and those can change very much from species to species. Also important, also for the overall quality of your process, is purity and species of origin. Also species of origin for authenticity. How do we know that beef is beef, and that we are actually proliferating the cells that we want to proliferate? So there is, for me, is one of the biggest chapter. Compositional data, you have to explain your analytical methods. So how you have analyzed, is it an accredited method or not? Is it something that you have developed in-house? Then you need to provide qualification and validation data. The 5 badges is one of the main difference with other geographies. For example, Singapore does accept between 3 and 5 badges. So that's also where it might be not necessarily easier, but faster to submit in Singapore. Contaminants, of course, are important. Contaminants that typically do not come from the cells, but comes from the raw materials, heavy metals, dioxins, other pollutants, pesticides, if you are using raw material of plant origin. Microbiology, of course, although in principle cultivated meat is like a self-controlling system, aseptic. So this is where probably the data will often turn up completely negative. And stability. So if you think about the shelf life of your product, I want this to last in the fridge for 6 months, you need to provide stability data on that. Specifications. So I showed you an example of specification of the apple, and that's actually something that you do not wait for the regulators to tell you what they are. You have to present them yourself in the dossier. So you have to think also what are the kind of what makes sense, and you have to propose your reasoning for your proposal, and then you have to see if those will be accepted or not. History of use is something very short in the case of cultivated meat, although there are more and more tastings and more approvals, so this might be changing hopefully soon. Use levels and intake. So food categories is something that it took me a while to get familiar with. When you submit something as an ingredient or as a whole food, but if it is an ingredient, you need to, there are food categories in a dedicated database, or few databases actually, and you have to see where the application applications of your food or your novel food. Just to make an example, you have recently seen approved like meal from like mealworm from insects, and those can be used like up to 100% in a certain product, or up to 20% in an energy bar, or other type of food categories with different levels of inclusion. And you have to, based on your target population, you have to calculate the anticipated intake of your novel food and all potential contaminants that come with your novel food. It is very complicated. Often we have to rely on consultants to do that. There is huge databases for encompassing the diet of different age group, different populations. It's very, very big. So this is the ADME is about the metabolism, absorption of your novel food, is where if you need to do actual bioavailability data, is where the data should go. You can also do a literature search again of your raw materials and see how those are, if at all, metabolized and absorbed by your by the body. The other big chapter and very important is the toxicological information that you need to include in your dossier. Lately, EFSA has been really, how can I say, in favor of reducing animal study as much as possible, and we welcome that approach. And one way of looking at cultivated meat as a novel food is to look at each individual raw materials and look for toxicity information of the individual raw materials. So of course this will vary tremendously from company to company. Some medium components are largely the same, but then we might be using different things that need different data. Allergenicity also, when especially for protein, there can be like proteins coming from the raw materials, and also here you need to perform an extensive literature research on allergens, and actually EFSA has a protocol for how the literature search should be made. And then last but not least, if you are replacing an existing food, how is your food going to impact the nutritional values of the population? So there is any impact, potential impact from anti-nutritional factor, vitamins and minerals intake? There are upper limits for some vitamins and for some minerals. So you have to compare the results of the analytics of your novel food with existing regulation and limits. So these are my main. There are many takeaways, many things to remember. For me, the first one, it is complex and complicated at the same time. So some parts are clear. It's just a lot of work. That's the complicated part. Some parts are not clear, and you kind of navigate in the dark, and that's where the complex part comes in. EFSA establishes if a novel food is safe under the proposed condition of use. They do not approve products. They do not decide on labeling. They only gives a scientific opinion on the safety, again, for the intended use that you have specified in your dossier. A missed notification of your study may result in a 6-month penalty, and I must say this is what is keeping me up at night as a producer. And finally, the new EFSA guidance brings quite a lot of clarity to the submission process. There are quite some useful addition and more details. However, the bar remains very high for the system in Europe compared to other geographies. Thank you for your attention.